very special guest, Paul Wiffen, and he's done everything: sound design, director, composer. What a career! So, Paul, thank you for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure.
So let's go back here again, talk about your sound design, how you got interested in synthesizers, and we'll start from there.
Okay, well, I was going to be, a rock star guitarist. That was plan A. And then
Right.
this annoying little thing called punk came along, and I suddenly found myself terribly overqualified. So I'd had piano lessons from the age of 5, so I could play keyboards, but obviously back in those days, the access to synths was much more restricted. There were far less on the market, and they were mostly very expensive. But I saw an advert in a British music paper called Melody Maker. It was one of the biggest at the time, saying synthesizer demonstrator wanted, must speak German. And I long finished studying French and German at the University of Oxford. And I was playing in bands, and I'd had access to a couple of keyboards, but they weren't really synthesizers. They were sort of multi-keyboards, piano strings, but one did have a bit of brass on it, which had some very basic things for changing the brass sound. And, years later, I would realize that was the first time I ever messed with what one might call synthesizer parameters.
Okay.
But this advert was for the launch of a new synth at the Frankfurt Music Show, and that's why they thought they needed a German speaker.
Okay.
I got the job. It was only meant to be a 2-week job, and this new synthesizer was the first ever under £99, which was back then, I suppose, about $170, $180. But it was a magic price point in Britain because £99. So it was
right.
2 numbers instead of 3.
Right.
And of course, what they didn't know, and I've since learned, is that Germans are very proud of speaking English. However good or bad it is, they love to show off that they speak English. So the only use my German got was translating the menu for the boss of the company, who was a rather large gentleman who loved his food. So I was translating the menus, and he loved that, but really didn't need the German at all. But Frankfurt is not far from France, and all the French people that turned up, they're the absolute opposite. They only speak English if absolutely necessary.
No, I know that.
When he heard me speaking French, and in fact, I opened up a new distributor for them in France, he was very impressed. And on the way back, he said, right, well, you seem to be a terribly useful chap. Let's find a longer term role for you. And he set me to go out selling to schools and colleges and other specialist institutions, including the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which is where the Doctor Who theme tune originally came from, and lots of other great stuff. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, if that ever got over to the States, that was all done by the Radiophonic Workshop. So the 2 weeks turned into 9 months. And in that time, I went and visited a lot of places. But the one problem with the synths that company made was they had no memories. So you had to get very good at getting a sound by setting all the knobs in the right position, because you couldn't store it. So I always say that's a great foundation for being a sound designer, because you can't cheat and use presets. So you have to do it. the following, I should mention that company went bust after about 9 months. And so I had a couple of months of unemployment. But when the directors of that company were trying to make some arrangement with me because they couldn't pay me for my last couple of months, they showed me this thing which appeared to be a booking for the Frankfurt show the following year. And I got together with one of the chaps who had been involved a little bit with the previous company, and we came up with a design for a synthesizer. But we didn't have enough time to get it working. But I did have a very flash-looking case with a lot of LEDs on it. The 7-segment LEDs that were very big at the time. And so, I drove out there with this prototype, but discovered that the payment that had been made was only a deposit on the booth, and they wanted another £3,000 to actually occupy and use the booth. So I was wandering around the day before the thing started, and looking pretty glum. And I ran into this lovely man from an English trade magazine called Music Business. And he'd seen me a couple of times in England demonstrating. And he said, "Ask why you're looking so glum." And I said, "Well, I thought I had a booth here, but I don't." He said, "Oh, come put it on my booth. They give me a free booth because I'm press."
No, okay.
The only problem is there's no power on the stand, which of course suited me nicely because I didn't have any electronic guts inside the thing. But, so we popped it on there. He said, "Right, now you have to do me a favor." And he took me over to a booth, Italian company called Elka. And that's where I came across this machine that was to be kind of the next big stage in my career. But the people that he knew well, because they were in the same town as him in Essex in England, were the British distributors. And they were very worried about this synthesizer because they'd only had accordions and then electronic organs before. They'd never actually seen, well, they had seen synthesizers, but they never had them to sell. So they were looking for an opinion on it, whether it was any good or not. And I took a look at, what it was doing and how many, various parameters it had. I said, well, this seems to be a very high-end synth. It's got 8 voices. The Prophet 10's got 10, but it seems like the voice architecture is better than a Prophet 10. And they said, that seems unlikely, I said, well, could you leave me alone with it for 10 minutes? So being mostly Italians, they all went off and had another of the coffee that, without which they don't seem to be able to function. I very quickly, found a couple of really good sounds. And by the time they came back, using the sequencer as well, I'd managed to get a pretty fair approximation of Fanfare for the Common Man, which had been a big hit for Emerson, Lake and Palmer, maybe 3 or 4 years earlier. And they all came in just as I got it all together. And they were, their jaws were on the ground because the designer, in the way of most designers, hadn't really bothered to make any sounds for it. So I made these sounds and I played them that. And then I came up with a few other things and they offered me a job on the spot. I went from being unemployed with nothing to sell to actually being hired. And in the course of that 5 days in Frankfurt, we got pre-orders for a load of them. And they asked me, would I do the factory presets? So obviously I'd made a few sounds during the course of the show, but they shipped one to my flat in Shepherd's Bush in West London. And I sat there for 3 or 4 weeks and came up with, a full set of factory presets for them, which, the old way of saving these things was cassette interfaces, which was a nightmare.
I imagine.
Used to do that and get that to them in Italy. And then they said, well, we'd like you to start taking it around and showing people. And at the price point it represented rather a threat, particularly to sequential circuits, whose profit was like the top machine at the time, and also to Oberheim, both being imported by some very strong distributors and retailers in the UK. And I couldn't get them to touch it because they didn't want the competition in their stores and in their catalogs, But I had a lot more success going round and showing it to people. And the French distributor came over, and well, in fact, he didn't tell me he was coming. I was doing a demo of it at a trade show at a very famous place called Alexandra Palace. And there he was in the front row grinning at me. So after I'd finished my demo, he said, I'm going to see Vangelis this evening. Do you want to come with me? Well, of course, I'd been obsessed with Vangelis for 6 or 7 years. And so I was delighted, so we went down in my car, and he said, we got to get there at 7. Well, we got there at 7, but Vangelis wasn't there. He never was. If he gave you a time, you could be dead sure that he was going to be late. So there was his engineer was there, so he let us in. He knew Francis, and I started mucking about with his CS80, which was the kind of up in the range Yamaha machine in those days.
Right.
And the next thing I knew, Vangelis was standing next to me and pushing me out the way. And I initially thought that, he was cross because I was playing with his lovely machine. But actually, the sound I'd made, he was so excited about. He wanted to get on and play it. And after he played it for about 15 or 20 seconds, he turned to look at me and said, I've just been given a film to do the soundtrack for, but the director says that he doesn't want any sounds in it that anyone has ever heard before. And he said, I've had this CS80, for 7 or 8 years now, and I've never heard that sound coming out of it. What are you doing for the next 3 months? And I said, well, I don't really know. I've got this sort of casual job taking a machine round to show people. Oh, he said, have you got a new synthesizer? So we dragged it up. His studio was in a very old building with a ghastly old lift in it, but we managed to get this Elka synth up to him. And, when he heard some of the sounds I had, he loved it. But then when he tried to play it and it wasn't velocity sensitive, he wasn't very interested. So I thought, well, I won't manage to sell him that. He said, well, don't, I was going to pack it up. He said, oh, don't take it away. I want you to get some of those sounds on my CS80. So I said, well, I've only ever played with one for like 15 minutes before you got here. And he said, well, if you got that sound in 15 minutes, I'm sure you can do others. So he then took us out to dinner. He couldn't tell us what the movie was at that stage, but he said, come back tomorrow. The studio's open all day. I won't get in till the evening, but just sit there with the CS80 and the Elka side by side, see what you can come up with. So I did that. And in the course of the day, I suppose I came up with 10 or 12 very similar sounds. And that sort of confirmed that that's what I'd be doing. He said, oh, you could still go and show your machine to other people because I only work at night. So I would turn up, whatever I'd been doing during the day, I'd turn up in the evening and, we would work on this soundtrack. So that's how I came to be like a professional sound designer. But nobody had ever paid
Wow.
me. Well, I've been paid for the factory presets by Elka, but nobody had actually paid me to work on, a film or anything and create specific bespoke sounds for the film.
Yeah.
So that was how that got started, really. And a funny thing was, I didn't tell a lot of people at the time because Blade Runner was seen to be this terrible flop. A lot of people didn't understand it. It didn't sell well in the cinema.
Right, I know.
And what really saved it was all the bootleg versions on VHS tape when they started to show it on TV. And that was really, and people were passing around, VHS tapes because the film company, they thought synthesizers would never catch on. So they'd actually had someone reorchestrate the music for an orchestra. And they released an orchestral album, and Vangelis went mad and sued them.
Oh my gosh.
So there was no soundtrack available for a long time. And I didn't say anything because the film hadn't done very well. And it was only at the end of the 80s that it really started to pick up this reputation. And I started to say, well, actually, I worked on that. I'd never mentioned it before.
Oh, that's amazing.
One likes to be associated with what seems to be a flop. But in the
but it's a cult classic now.
Once I told other people, that I'd worked for Vangelis, and then Jeff Downes, who was originally in the Buggles, and then Yes, but
right, oh yeah,
he was the biggest band in the world, Asia. He hired me to do sound design for him.
Wow.
He recommended me to Keith Emerson, and then Emerson recommended me to his neighbor, Paul McCartney. And I ended up, I ended up playing on a song called Spies Like Us by Paul McCartney, which was for a film for the chap who directed the Thriller video, John Landis. He'd done the Blues Brothers and and then my name got mentioned to Stevie Wonder by Paul McCartney.
See, that's amazing. Oh my gosh.
And he said, well, I've mentioned you to Stevie. And I said, well, that's good because I'm moving out there. I had been offered a job as the launch editor of a technology magazine, Music Technology. So I didn't actually know how to get in touch with him, but I was sharing an apartment in Marina del Rey with a chap called Andy Thomas, a Welsh guy who was the #1 guy on PPG synths. And Stevie had some PPG stuff, and one of his technical people came round to update some EPROMs or something. I got introduced, and he said, "Oh, that name rings a bell. We've heard about you." And I said, "Oh, well, was it from Paul McCartney?" He said, "Yeah, that would have been it." Anyway, I showed him a couple of things from sequential circuits that I had in my room in the house there.
Right.
And about a week later, he phoned up and said, "Stevie's just bought the new sequential drum machine called the Studio 440, but we don't like the sounds that come with it, and there aren't many." And I said, "Well, I've been told that all the discs from the Prophet 2000 load into the Studio 440. So I'm quite happy to bring my big library over and we'll see what happens, but I'm not making any promises."
Right.
And my flatmate, Andy, very kindly lent me his car because I didn't even have a car at the time. And I drove into Koreatown on the 10 freeway. And the whole way I'm going, "Please let the discs load. Please let the discs load."
That's something.
And I got in and they were all stood around waiting for me, which is even more pressure.
Oh, I can imagine.
And I put the first disc in of some drum sounds and they worked. And it was just
my gosh,
the greatest relief. And the next thing I knew, within days, I was working on his album.
Unbelievable.
Called Characters. And the single from that album, Skeletons, won the R&B Grammy at the Grammy Awards at
Mm.
the beginning of 1987.
Wow.
And then I was hired to stay on and do the rest of the album. So we did that, and that took, I guess, till the summer. In the meantime, Oberheim, who I'd been helping out a bit, asked me to do the Chicago NAMM show that summer,
Right.
just about when we'd finished working on the rest of the album. And then after I'd done that, incidentally meeting the keyboard player with Leonard Cohen, who heard some of my demos, and he'd been talking to Leonard about re-recording his a version of his own of First We Take Manhattan, which had been a hit
Wow. Right.
for Jennifer Warnes, I think her name was. She was one of Leonard's backing singers, and he'd let her have the song, and she'd done quite a rock version of it. He'd got interested in European disco.
Oh, wow.
And wanted to do that. And so I was brought in, and because I'd actually done a demo at the NAMM show with Oberheim using their equipment to get like a European Giorgio Moroder type disco sound instead of all the Americans were amazing at jazz rock and all this kind of stuff, but they just didn't have a clue how European disco worked. So I did that for Leonard, and then, got to work on one Michael Jackson song for Quincy. Then I went. Go? Yeah, well, Michael wasn't there most of the time, but obviously Quincy was in charge, and he had this wonderful engineer called Bruce Sweden, and we worked very closely and got this. The song was Dirty Diana, and we got this, string part that Quincy was looking for, and they said, "Can you make me a big noise to start the record off?" And I ended up using a synclavier that was stuck in the studio because
that's great.
I'd become familiar with the synclavier because Stevie had one, and I did this sound which ended up on the front of the record. So if you listen to Dirty Diana, the first 40 seconds is just
I'm gonna have to.
Yeah.
Oh boy, so, that's something.
That was another a nice thing. So then I went back to Europe because I was still trying to make a long distance relationship with a girlfriend in London work.
Right.
And we went off on a holiday to the south of France, and on our way back, in those days, no mobile phones, nothing like that.
Right.
So I'd left various numbers of people that I knew we were going to be visiting. And on the way back, everywhere that I arrived, they said, "Oh, Stevie Wonder's people have been on the telephone. They need you. They need you."
Again, huh?
And it was always the wrong time of day to get anyone in Los Angeles. Anyway, I got to Paris, and this friend who'd introduced me to Vangelis and all I walked into his store and he went, "Oh, Stevie Wonder's been on his telephone. He needs you."
Oh, boy.
Anyway, fortunately, in those days, you couldn't just ask people, "Can I ring Los Angeles?" It cost a fortune.
Right.
But, he had a store and he spoke to California all the time. He was just loving going around the store saying, "Oh, he's speaking to Stevie Wonder in Los Angeles." Well, of course I wasn't. I was speaking to Stevie's people, but it transpired that the European tour was starting in London with 9 nights at Wembley Arena.
Wow!
And he had this old British guy as his in charge of all his equipment.
Right.
And this guy said, "Right, I'm sending all the stuff to London on a plane, and you've got to go to Bray Studios." And it's all being delivered there. It hasn't been out of storage for 2 years because it's all the stuff we use on the road. So I went there on the first morning I got back from my holiday, and I went out there, and this guy Mick had flown in, but Mick knew what Stevie had in, which boxes he was in, but he wasn't, he wasn't a person who knew anything more than just switching them on. So I sat there going through keyboard after doing triage. Some of them came out and worked straight away, and others came out and they lit up, but they didn't make any sounds. I had about 3 days there to try and get it all working. Then it all got shipped to Wembley Arena because they'd arranged to have 2 nights where the arena hadn't been sold out for someone else before his run of 9 nights started. So then we started to build it on. The band flew in, and I, tried to. The band were the same band that had toured with him previously, so they knew what it was supposed to be doing. So between us, we got it all working. Stevie didn't fly in until the actual day of the first gig.
Oh my God!
And I was sat there during sound check, still pretending to be Stevie and my half-assed version of Higher Ground or whatever it was, with the band, so that they could go through the songs. And Stevie walked on stage about 20 minutes before, the advertised start time.
Oh my gosh!
Amazingly, it all worked. So
thanks to you. Thanks to you.
And I know we did the whole of Europe. And on my birthday, he let me. I first got interested in synths because of his song "Living for the City," which has this really amazing synth solo between every verse and chorus. And that was actually done by the Tonto guys, who had this huge studio full of interconnected synths. And I was trying to recreate it with MIDI, and it took me quite some time because it was a very complex sound, but I eventually got there. And Stevie said, right, well, now you've got it right, I think you should play it tomorrow night. I'm like, wow. Are you serious? No, no, you can come on stage. So on my 29th birthday, I got to play Living for the City on
that's something.
On stage in Berlin with Stevie Wonder. And
that must have been nerve-wracking, to make sure everything worked.
I wasn't doing that much playing because most of the people I work with, as soon as you got the sound right, they shoved you out the way because only they were authorized to play the keyboard, So I wasn't, at my most practiced up on that side. But, it went off all right, and turned out that some friends of mine were in the audience and they had no idea that I was even working for Stevie, let alone, doing what I was doing.
That.
They were gobsmacked. I was thinking, what a shame no one that knows me is witnessing this, but they were. And they even actually managed to get some really bad photographs of me on stage.
No, boy.
So, that was... I ran into them about 6 months later, and they were from Emu, and they were like, wow, we just saw Stevie was playing, got tickets at the last minute. The last thing we were expecting was a friend of ours on stage, so it was, they were in the 80s. Things just seemed to fall into line, it was an amazing time. And I guess I was one of the few doing it back then. And they hadn't really even come up with the term sound design, synthesizer programmer was what we said we were. But they had to come up with something else once the samplers came in, because you weren't programming a synthesizer on a sampler. You were creating sounds a different way. So, so that was really how I spent the 80s, And I was based mainly in LA when we got back off that tour, it was a great time. But then, it just seemed to lose its sheen, and I got very interested in digital audio. So I spent most of the 90s working with computer companies like, first of all, DigiDesign, when they were still called Digi Drums. they used to sell their
okay.
chips through
Didn't know
sequential.
that.
They went into sequential drum machine. So I got to know them quite early on before they ever called themselves DigiDesign. And I, started to get interested in digital audio. But then I met this amazing guy from Cambridge University, Dr. Mike Lynch, and he had ways to do it on the much cheaper Ataris. So suddenly, especially in Europe where the Atari was so strong, I started getting involved in that, ended up working for Atari because they were desperately trying to break their machines in America in the same way that they were working in Europe. Everyone had an Atari for sequencing in Europe, but it was much less possible, much less popular in the States. So they hired me so I kind of went back to the States, but now I was working for Atari and demoing this Falcon computer, which was the last one they made, which did 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz audio with no additional hardware. Where, you had to buy a much more expensive Mac and then put a DigiDesign card in it to get the same thing going on. So most of the 90s, I think I would say I was involved in some way or other in MIDI sequencing and digital audio on the same computer. And at the end of that period, I ended up working for Apple, who were then sort of caught up. So around the millennium, I went to work for Apple, and they had a big thing with OS 10 just coming out. And I became the evangelist who had to go around and persuade all the guys who were working on Apple that they needed to upgrade from OS 9 to OS 10. So that was kind of how I spent the 90s, was on digital audio. But while I was with Apple, I started to get, I'd bought my own DV camera. I'd made a few little music videos and holiday videos and that sort of thing. And when I went to work for Apple, it was just as they were upgrading Final Cut Pro to work on the new high definition cameras that were coming out from Sony and Panasonic. And I ended up, they asked me to do demos on that as well. And I ended up, becoming so interested in filmmaking that I sort of let the musical side go, although I was always writing the music for whatever I was doing. But that's really, it was my time with Apple where I sort of transferred from music to filmmaking, really. I never really
talk a little bit about Peter Gabriel. I mean, we spoke the last time. You worked with Peter Gabriel, right?
I need to
must have been
getting very dry from talking.
Yeah.
You can cut that bit out.
We'll edit it, no problem.
I'd always prided myself on being able to get to any artist that I liked. So, in the 80s, I'd gotten to Ultravox, and I'd got them using another synth I was involved with, and ended up working the day before the big Band Aid recording. I worked with
that's amazing
on the backing track.
That is something.
And then there were loads of other artists who I admired, and I got to meet Rick Wakeman, and I got to meet lots of people, but I couldn't get near Peter Gabriel. It was like the universe was toying with me or something. And it wasn't that it was difficult to find him, because he had this great big studio called Real World, and there were, article after article about it in magazines, how it was the cutting edge of everything. And I started to even get gigs programming for other people at Peter's studio. And I was down there on one of those, and there was a lovely, they put us in a hotel at the top of the hill, and there was a lovely path. The road went down the hill, but there was a lovely path across the fields. And I was walking down to the studio one morning, and there were these two people walking towards me, but I got fixated on the one in front because it was Rosanna Arquette, who I
Yeah,
recognized,
okay.
you know, and this was when she and Peter were an item. And so I sort of stopped to let her through. I don't know if you know what a kissing gate is. I'm sure you don't have them in America, but it's a
No.
gate that swings through about 40 degrees, enough to let one
Okay.
person through, and then you swing it back the other way. So I let her through, didn't even notice the bloke behind, but it was Peter Gabriel.
Oh,
He stopped to
that's
let me through, but
funny.
of course I recognized him. But what do you say when you just, so I went, thank you very much.
That's right.
And then about 2 days later on the same project, there was Peter whizzing round the outside of Real World on a go-kart that he got to play
Oh,
with.
that's funny.
And, you know, he grinned at me as he went whizzing by, but again, no chance to make any conversation. Yeah. I was very frustrated about all that. So I went to work for Korg a bit later because they started to get digital audio products. And so I just rang up the studio and I said, we've got some new Korg products and we think Peter might be interested in them. They said, oh, great. He always loves looking at new gear. So eventually, in about 1997, I finally got to meet him properly after, 10 years of being toyed with by the universe and never quite meeting him.
That's funny.
And, we hit it off and he found me terribly useful for the things that, other people weren't so good with. And in particular, he was a big user of Apple computers. And I was, at the time, I was writing the Apple notes in a magazine called Sound on Sound. And I was, getting closer and closer to Apple. And so I ended up doing all his Macintosh maintenance. And they had something like 20 Macs in the whole of his Real World studios, plus all his laptops, and he was a bit frustrated because the laptops weren't as good for digital audio as the desktop computers. But I'd found some products that helped with that and let you use cards that were only meant to be used on the desktops, a sort of chassis that sat underneath a laptop. And then he asked me to, I mentioned I was going to the AES in New York, and he said, well, after the show, would you go and help my two daughters who were studying in New York and set their laptops off for them? So we ended up, he let me stay in his apartment on Broadway.
Oh, great. Wow.
While I sorted out the Macs for his two daughters. They were, one was in her early 20s and the other was in the late teens. And Anne-Marie was wanting to do film, and Melanie, the younger one, wanted to do music. And she ended up singing with Peter on various tours.
Right, I remember that.
But I got to set up their stuff, and that was quite a thing, and stay in Peter's own apartment on Broadway.
That's amazing.
That was just, that's the kind of nicest
surreal, right?
Any artist has ever done. For money's nice, but there are some things that are, beyond money, aren't they? When an artist lends you.
There's some people out there, they're just nice,
Yeah, absolutely. And Pete's one of the nicest I've met. I have this thing I call the tea test. The first time we went down to show Peter stuff, he stood around looking interested for a bit, but he could tell it was going to take a bit of time. He said, well, I'm not much use here. Let me get the tea and coffees organized. So he went round meticulously writing down whether you wanted tea or coffee, milk, sugar, all the variations. I assumed he'd just pick up a phone and, ask somebody to bring it through. But no, he disappeared off. And about 20 minutes later, came back with a massive, great tray and,
amazing.
all the things and little Post-it notes on everyone as to which, was just extraordinary. And there's only one other guy that I've worked with in 40 years who's like that, who's made me a cup of tea, and that's Brian May.
I
one of the
imagine
things
that.
I went on to after Apple was surround sound, and I was
Right.
involved in the DVD release of A Night at the Opera, which included, the I think it was actually a 7.1 remix of Bohemian Rhapsody. And when I ran into him again in Los Angeles as they were doing the mix down, when he found out I had some British tea bags with me, he was like, "Oh, give me a couple of those. I'll go and make us a cup of tea." And it's my test for grounded artists, the
Yeah.
ones that are secure in what they're doing. They don't have the hubris, and therefore, if it's better that they make the tea because someone else has got a more tricky job to do, they just go and make the tea. But they're very few and far between.
I'm sure there are. I'm sure you met some real doozies that. So let's talk about your films that you did, the documentaries.
Yeah, well, the start that I got was that they wanted a demonstration at the Cannes Film Festival of this new high definition capability of the software, because before that it had been perfect for more sort of home users and amateur filmmakers. But once you went in a high definition, which was kind of the top of the industry in 2001, 2002, everybody wanted this new high definition, which was starting to look like it might rival the old, film celluloid. Right. And so the first thing I did was I'd done a bit of work with Panasonic, who made keyboards under the name Technics. And so I contacted them because they at least knew me and said, "I'm working for Apple now, and they've got this new software which will edit high definition over FireWire connections." And the guys at Panasonic said, "Well, we've only got one prototype at the moment, but there's a week when we're not using it." And I ended up going to one department of the BBC who'd been checking it technically. And then they said, "You can have it for 9 days until it's got to go into another department of the BBC in London for, to start to evaluate it artistically as to whether it can, do the job that they want and the pictures are good enough and this sort of thing." And in those 9 days, because I'm never one for, not being adventurous, I shot enough of a film with a load of actors who needed showreel to actually convince people that I had made the whole movie. I hadn't. I'd made about a third of it, but I cut that together on the booth at Cannes in the Marché, the Marché part of the festival. And, people were coming by and I was showing, editing it. And Panasonic had shipped one of the cameras down there. So it was stood on the booth and all the DOPs were able to, have a look at it, mess about with it. And, that was my introduction to filmmaking, really. And I'd always wanted to be a filmmaker, but, in the old days, you had to leave school at 16 and make tea on the film set. And then somebody might, after a couple of years, they might let you help move the camera about. And after a bit more of that, they might let you be the focus puller. And, after 10 years, you might be a cameraman or a director of photography. And if you had a lucky break after that, you might become a director. But I had no time for that. Plus, my parents were never going to let me not go to university. I had a choice at university. When I was 5, somebody said, "Oh, I think he's Oxbridge material." So thereafter, it was Oxford or Cambridge. That's what Oxbridge means. And so I did have a choice, but it was Oxford or Cambridge. I wouldn't have been allowed to go anywhere else. So it was just a dream that I'd given up on because the career path was so different from the one I'd taken. But what these digital cameras did was they made it so that anyone could pick up a camera. You know, the first DV cameras were only a few £100. So, you know, it's suddenly a lot of other people came in. And then, you know, once I started working for Apple, people like Sony and Panasonic were okay with lending me cameras. So I made that trailer, and without a word of the lie, that's got me every directing job I ever did.
Wow, that's something.
I send it to people, they just assume I made a whole movie.
Right.
And they go, well, yeah, we've got a project and we could really do with someone like you who's got such a cinematic eye. And so I started making, and then Peter Gabriel introduced me to, he's the guy who discovered him originally, Jonathan King.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. I know that name.
And I I've now done 6 films with Jonathan King.
Oh,
Jonathan's films are really to promote his existing, you know, he's made over 1,000 hit singles for either himself or other artists.
That is amazing.
Himself under the name of another artist or whatever. And, you know, his retirement, because, you know, he just turned 80 a few days ago.
Okay.
It's all about reselling his old catalogue. And so, you know, he makes these films and uses, they're sort of musicals. He was also the publisher for ABBA in the UK.
Oh,
He saw what happened when Mamma Mia went on first in the theatre and then into movies, you know, that the catalogue started selling like crazy. So he thought, why not mine as well? So over 15 years now, I've probably done 6 or 7 films for him.
Wow.
And they don't feel quite authentic as films because he gives them away for free on the internet and waits for the downloads or nowadays streams start coming in. People get, oh, I love that song when I heard it 25 years ago. I'm going to go and get that and put it on my phone or whatever. So it just didn't quite feel authentic. But then due to a variety of circumstances, I ended up wanting to leave the UK when the COVID nightmare started because I'd vaguely known that idiot Boris Johnson when I was at university. He was at Oxford as well. And I just knew that he'd find a way to mess everything up. So I looked online for where the least number of cases being reported were, and it said Greece. I had this script from a screenwriter that I'd worked with on numerous occasions, and it wasn't very good, but I knew I could doctor it and make it work. And it was about Leonard Cohen's time on the island of Hydra in the 60s before he became famous.
That's really interesting.
When he thought he was a novelist, and it was meeting this Marianne Illen on Hydra that, you know, when you fall in love, a novel's not a very good way of, you know, showing your emotions, whereas the poems and songs that he started writing were, but he still didn't believe they were anything more than the way that he would express what he was feeling. But of course, they become some of the greatest songs ever written. And,
they are,
and this was a whole process over about 6 or 7 years. And this screenwriter, a guy from Ireland who I'd worked with before, had actually met Leonard in the late 70s on Hydra when he was still there.
Wow.
So he wrote the script. I went over to look and see if the island was any good. And of course, it's absolutely beautiful, picturesque island. So I sat there with a couple of friends that I knew from Athens, and I was doctoring the script to make it better and seeing the location, so making it fit. And the Greeks closed the airports.
Oh.
So I was stuck.
Oh, boy.
Greece. And then the one good thing Boris Johnson did was said, well, seeing as we've said that all you self-employed people can't work, you're now allowed to claim what's called universal credit in England, which is like unemployment benefit.
Right.
But you've got to claim it online because we can't do any in-person interviews so of course, that meant that I was then able to get online, claim the universal credit, and it was about £400 a month, about $500.
Right.
Well, in London, that doesn't go very far.
No, imagine
on a little
not.
Greek island, you could live like a king. So I had this lovely 2 or 3 months out there, and then a film producer who I knew turned up in Athens because he was trying to finish a documentary he was making for a charity on donkeys. And I tagged along with him to the island of Santorini, which is very famous for the donkeys taking the tourists about. So,
okay.
But the donkeys weren't working there because it was, lockdown, and the cruise liners weren't calling at Santorini. So the donkeys were all in a field.
Oh, my God.
And he said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I've got to get this film finished. And I said, well, I was on Hydra for 2-3 months, and the donkeys are all working there because there's no vehicles, there's no cars.
Right.
So the donkeys are the transportation. He was a bit cynical at first, but he didn't have any other way of doing it. So he said, well, let's go there. So we went there. And of course, there were the donkeys everywhere you looked.
That's funny.
He got to finish his charity documentary. And then on his last night, he said, I love this island. I wish there was another reason to be here. And so I showed him the script. Well, I emailed him the script as when I got back from our last dinner. And he went and read it in his hotel room. And the next morning, he rang me up at 6 a.m. He said, right, we're leaving at 10 o'clock, but you and I are having breakfast because I think we can make this. And we sat there over breakfast and agreed that, in a couple of months' time, we'd come back. And, he went back to England first, but I eventually managed to get back to England because, of course, all my relatives were dead scared for me.
I'm sure.
I was in a place with absolutely no COVID,
yeah,
and they were in the middle of it all. But, it's that human instinct to gather all your loved ones together into a cluster.
Right.
So they were relieved to see me. But, within a couple of months, we were back out on the island of Hydra and actually shooting the film. We found, great actors in London who weren't able to work in the theatres because they'd been closed down. And we managed to get this Norwegian actress to play Marianne Illen, who was, of course, herself Norwegian.
Right.
And she was famous through a TV show with, she had 2 million followers on Instagram because she was like this famous teenage actress. Well, like most actors and actresses playing teenagers on TV, she was a bit older than that. But she was the perfect age for Marianne Illen, who was 25 when Leonard Cohen met her, and this girl was coming up to her 25th birthday, and she was struggling to find work because of COVID and everything.
Right.
So it all came together fantastic.
That's amazing.
And it's taken some time since because of problems with getting the publishing and stuff I won't bore you with. But that film is now on both Amazon Prime and Apple TV.
I got to catch that.
Yeah. It's called So Long, Marianne. And I'm told it's doing very well. That we came up with a cell line before he wrote Hallelujah. Leonard Cohen thought he was a novelist. And it just tells people who Leonard is, because far more people know the song Hallelujah than know Leonard Cohen.
That's true. You're right.
It's really helped. And, that's now kind of in 2024, I finally have what has become the benchmark for a successful film director, which is online streaming of your films.
Right.
Cinema is still a treat, but most people are watching.
That's true. You're right.
That's been the big thing for me in 2024, and I'm now trying to get together with various people to make the follow-up film. And amusingly, I finally showed it to somebody who was helping me to get So Long Marianne on these streaming services. And he went, "Oh, vampire film. This was the demo I'd done for Apple 20 years earlier. And I've got a studio in Bucharest in Romania that needs, work, and I think I can make that." So I'm not counting my chickens, as we say, but he seems to want to do that in a country which is ideal for shooting vampire films.
So I'm sure it is. Yeah.
I'm hoping that that comes together for early next year.
So is that what you're going to be working on?
Well, I've got half a dozen scripts, and I
Okay.
never, as I say, count my chickens, but I really would like to get that film made properly, because, it's got me every other job just showing people that trailer. But, it would be nice to actually make the film properly.
You've had such a fantastic career, Paul. I don't want to take up any more time.
I like to think my biggest skill is being in the right place at the right time.
Well, it's luck. It's a matter of luck.
But
right
you know what they
right
say,
time.
don't you? Luck is 10%.
That's true.
Serendipity, but you've got to have done the 90% of the work to be able to take advantage of the luck.
Yeah, and these big stars knew you were really good, so they hired you. Paul McCartney is just not going to hire anybody to work on his songs.
Yeah, well, he bought this Emulator 2 sampler, couldn't get on with it, and he had to mention to Keith Emerson when they met, in the local pub or whatever it was, and Keith said, "Oh, yeah, you better get this guy Paul Wiffen in, because he came down to my place and he knew his way around it." So it's things like that.
It's like anything else.
In the 80s, there were far less of us doing this whole sound design business.
Right. I'm sure.
So people would pass your phone number around. By people, I mean top people.
Right, A-list,
A-list
people,
A-list stars.
Yeah,
you don't get any of that anymore. I tell you, the only sound design work left is for manufacturers and software developers, and I've just got a big contract to do that with one of them, and it's on that a software clone of the Elka Synthex that I first worked on in 1982, and the Italian company, and it got me through the door. And of course, one of the things we missed out was that Jean-Michel Jarre started to use one of the sounds like five years after I designed it. And for him, it was the only sound that he ever used with his laser harp. So
man, that's amazing.
One sound I created became synonymous with the laser harp. And now a company who's Arturia, French company, have produced a software clone of it. And, in the next couple of days, I've got to knuckle down to start. They want 64 new sounds for this.
Holy smoke. Wow.
So, what goes around comes around, as we say.
So what do you think the future of music is going forward now with all this AI, with all this digital?
Well, I have to say I'm worried. I'm hopeful that it's film that's going to keep me eating for the next few years. But, in terms of, I now think that there are far too many tools.
That's true. I agree.
There's companies like Behringer making.
Oh yeah, they're cloning everything.
Clone after clone in
Yes.
hardware.
Right.
And then there's lots of other companies like Arturia making clone after clone in software. And, you know, there's all these people making this stuff, but the guys who we get to hear, I'm not saying that there aren't some great musicians out there.
Oh,
but the guys that we get to hear are making simpler and simpler stuff with, you know, just a fraction of the capabilities of the instruments. And
right.
It's certainly not my kind of music. And, you know, everyone's being offered work, but only for that wonderful term exposure. So you're not actually getting paid, but it's like, oh, if you work for us for free, you'll get exposure on our film.
Oh, yeah. Right.
You know, it's no way to run an industry.
No.
And even if, like me, you think of it more as a cultural art form than an industry, if people can't make a living in it, you know, you're not going to attract the best people. You're going to get all the guys who work in a bank or whatever during the day. They get enough money to buy all this kit, but they don't really know what they're doing with it.
No.
So they only get like a smidgen of what the potential of you know, some very great tools are, you know. So I'm not optimistic, to be honest. And every time I turn the radio on, you know, there's I call it broken synthesizer music.
Yes, I agree.
It doesn't sound like it's badly programmed. It actually sounds like it's broken.
Right, it does.
You know, it seems to fill dance floors and whatever. DJs are all making fortunes from playing it.
Oh, they are.
You know, but you know, things like Spotify have pulled the rug out under anyone's income.
Oh, they have. Oh, forget it.
You know,
right.
I don't see where it's all going to end.
No.
I'm just glad that I've still got contracts.
That's great.
You know, on the music side, and I hope to get, you know, some more films going. Now I've got one on Amazon Prime, because that seems to be like the benchmark for a successful director.
It does.
If you're not on Amazon Prime, who are you? You know,
that's true. You're right.
So,
you're right.
You know, I hope, you know, there'll be work to see me out. But for anyone, you know, who's 20 something and hoping to get into it all, you know, I don't think they'll get the breaks I got. I was just there in the golden years. You know,
you were.
And I say the 80s was the golden years for sound designers, the 90s for digital audio, and then I kind of made my transfer to filmmaking just as digital, which had revolutionized audio, was revolutionizing film. So I got in on the ground floor again there and have kind of come up with it. And, you know, I don't see how, you know, they just, when you say that the technology democratizes everything, the main thing that does is give you hundreds of thousands of competitors.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're all trying to get your head above the parapet to be spotted.
Right, exactly.
But there's a million others, you know.
Right.
How are you ever going to get noticed or whatever? You know, I'm just grateful that I got started when these technologies were a bit more exclusive, and therefore you didn't have so many other people. And if you were sort of ambitious and hardworking, you could find those opportunities because they were few and far between. The problem is now that, you know, everyone's got access to the internet. Everyone can bung their stuff up on YouTube or,
everybody's a star.
But then how do you get discovered? Because it's needle in a haystack time, isn't it?
It is. Well, that's what social media did. It's like everybody can be a star now in their own mind, like on all these social media
they
sites.
Think just because they've had thousands of views or millions of likes that they're in some sort. But then they've got to become the influencer or something to monetize that.
That's right.
They don't get anything for what they actually do. So they then start, having to be sort of cheap advertising.
Exactly. That's right.
And whatever. Yeah, as I say, I'm glad at 66, that I've got residual stuff coming from my early career.
Right.
To actually let me, keep getting hired to do things.
Well, Paul, this has been a pleasure. I want to thank you again for doing this.
No, I'm delighted.
You're one of the.
It's a great time to be doing it because there's not much floating about,
No, I'm trying to give exposure
between Christmas and New Year.
And this series has been about people like you and Dick Odell and whoever else has not had exposure that people don't know about anymore that they need to know.
Well, we were the backroom boys,
right?
But, we didn't really need to be famous in our own right because the stars would share us with the other stars. But now it's much more about, you've got to appeal to a much broader demographic of people. So
exactly.
It is nice to finally stick your head above the parapet and say, oh, yeah, this is what I did way back when.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
It does seem to help with getting hired now. So
yes.
Always happy to do it.
All right, Paul. Pleasure having you on. And would we go to your website? Where can we find all your...
Well, the best thing is if there's kind of different things for different parts of my career. I haven't even mentioned the drone piloting stuff, which I love, great lover of toys. So when drones became affordable, I went. So I've got a page on Vimeo. Okay. So vimeo.com/Paul Wiffen.
Okay.
And that is principally all my drone work.
Okay.
But most of it is set to my music. So you'll get to hear a lot of my own music as well.
Oh, okay.
Then I've got a Facebook page,
Of course. That's how I found you.
.com/Paul.Wiffen. And that is kind of a general page about my stuff. But I do have Facebook.com synth guru Wiffen, and that is very specifically about sound design, electronics, and there's some of the anecdotes from my career, but always tied in with the music that was made and the sounds that were designed.
Well,
so those are ways to find me. And I can stick those, on the chat here, so that
just send those over to me if you want. Email me over.
I'll do it right now because if I don't, I'll forget. So as soon as we stop talking, I'll type those in.
Thank you. Paul,
all right.
Thank you again. It's been great. Great fun, and you've been a real inspiration to everybody. And thank you for your work.
No, my pleasure. And I'm starting to type now.
Take care now.
Okay, bye-bye.
Have a great New Year. Bye-bye.
And you and everyone else.
Bye-bye.